Introduction to The Autobiography of a Thief. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of a Thief by Hutchins Hapgood. Introduction. Oh, happy he who can still hope to emerge from this sea of error. Faust. There is no man doth a wrong for the wrong's sake, but thereby to purchase himself profit, or pleasure, or honor, or the like. Therefore why should I be angry with a man for loving himself better than me? And if any man should do wrong merely out of ill nature, why, yet it is but like the thorn or briar, which prick and scratch, because they can do no other. Bacon. Editor's Note: I met the ex-pickpocket and burglar whose autobiography follows soon after his release from a third term in the penitentiary. For several weeks I was not particularly interested in him. He was full of a desire to publish in the newspapers an exposé of conditions obtaining in two of our state institutions, his motive seeming partly revenge and partly a very genuine feeling that he had come in contact with a systematic crime against humanity. But as I continued to see more of him, and learned much about his life, my interest grew, for I soon perceived that he not only had led a typical thief's life, but was also a man of more than common natural intelligence, with a gift of vigorous expression. With little schooling he had yet educated himself, mainly by means of the prison libraries, until he had a good and individually expressed acquaintance with many of the English classics, and with some of the masterpieces of philosophy. That this ex-convict, when a boy on the East Side of New York City, should have taken to the graft seemed to me, as he talked about it, the most natural thing in the world. His parents were honest, but ignorant and poor. One of his brothers, a normal and honorable man, is a truck driver with a large family, and his relatives and honest friends in general belong to the most modest class of working people. The swell among them is another brother, who is a policeman, but Jim, the ex-convict, is by far the cleverest and most intelligent of the lot. I have often seen him and his family together on Saturday nights, when the clan gathers in the truckman's house for a good time, and he is the life of the occasion, and admired by the others. Jim was an unusually energetic and ambitious boy, but the respectable people he knew did not appeal to his imagination. As he played on the street, other boys pointed out to him the swell thief at the corner saloon, and told him tales of big robberies and exciting adventures, and the prizes of life seemed to him to lie along the path of crime. There was no one to teach him what constitutes real success, and he went in for crime with energy and enthusiasm. It was only after he had become a professional thief, and had done time in prisons, that he began to see that crime does not pay. He saw that all his friends came to ruin, that his own health was shattered, and that he stood on the verge of the madhouse. His self-education in prison helped him, too, to the perception that he had made a terrible mistake. He came to have intellectual ambitions, and no longer took an interest in his old companions. After several weeks of constant association with him, I became morally certain that his reform was as genuine as possible under the circumstances, and that, with fair success in the way of getting something to do, he would remain honest. I therefore proposed to him to write an autobiography. He took up the idea with eagerness, and through the entire period of our work together has shown an unwavering interest in the book, and very decided acumen and common sense. The method employed in composing the volume was that, practically, of the interview. From the middle of March to the 1st of July, we met nearly every afternoon and many evenings at a little German café on the East Side. There I took voluminous notes, often asking questions, but taking down as literally as possible his story in his own words. To such a degree is this true, that the following narrative is an authentic account of his life, with occasional descriptions and character sketches of his friends of the underworld. Even without my explicit assurance, the autobiography bears sufficient internal evidence of the fact that, essentially, it is a thief's own story. Many hours of the daytime, when I was busy with other things, my friend, for I have come to look upon him as such, was occupied with putting down on paper character sketches of his pals and their careers, or recording his impressions of the life they had followed. After I had left town for the summer, in order to prepare this volume, I wrote to Jim repeatedly, asking for more material on certain points. This he always furnished in a manner which showed his continued interest, and a literary sense, though fragmentary, of no common kind. H. H. End of introduction. Chapter 1 of The Autobiography of a Thief. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Autobiography of a Thief by Hutchins Hapgood, Chapter 1, Boyhood and Early Crime. I have been a professional thief for more than 20 years. Half of that time I have spent in State's prison, and the other half in Grafton in one form or another. I was a good pickpocket and a fairly successful burglar, and I have known many of the best crooks in the country. I have left the business for good, and my reasons will appear in the course of this narrative. I shall tell my story with entire frankness. I shall not try to defend myself. I shall try merely to tell the truth. Perhaps in so doing I shall explain myself. I was born on the east side of New York City in 1868 of poor but honest parents. My father was an Englishman who had married an Irish girl and emigrated to America, where he had a large family, no one of whom, with the exception of myself, went wrong. For many years he was an employee of Brown Brothers and Company, and was a sober, industrious man, and a good husband and kind father. To me, who was his favorite, he was perhaps too kind. I was certainly a spoiled child. I remember that when I was 5 years old, he bought me a $25 suit of clothes. I was a vigorous, handsome boy with red, rosy cheeks, and was not only the pet of my family, but the life of the neighborhood as well. At that time, which is as far back as I can remember, we were living on Monroe Street in the 7th Ward. This was then a good residential neighborhood, and we were comfortable in our small wooden house. The people about us were Irish and German, the large Jewish immigration not having begun yet. Consequently, Lower New York did not have such a strong business look as it has now, but was cleanly and respectable. The gin mills were fewer in number, and were comparatively decent. When the Jews came, they started many basement saloons or cafés, and for the first time, I believe, the social evil began to be connected with the drinking places. I committed my first theft at the age of 6. Older heads put me up to steal money from the till of my brother's grocery store. It happened this way. There were several much older boys in the neighborhood who wanted money for rowboating in theaters. One was 18 years old, a ship caulker, and another was a roustabout of 17. I used to watch these boys practice singing and dancing in the big marble lots in the vicinity. How they fired my youthful imagination! They told me about the theaters then in vogue, Tony Pastor's, the Old Globe, Wood's Museum, and Josh Hart's Theatre Comique, afterwards owned by Harrigan and Hart. One day George, the roustabout, said to me, "Kid, do you want to go rowboating with us?" When I eagerly consented, he said it was too bad, but the boat cost 50 cents and he only had a 10-cent stamp, a small paper bill. In those days there was very little silver in circulation. I did not bite at once, I was so young, and they treated me to one of those wooden balls fastened to a rubber string that you throw out and catch on the rebound. I was tickled to death. I shall never forget that day as long as I live. It was a Saturday, and all day long those boys couldn't do too much for me. Towards evening they explained to me how to rob my brother's till. They arranged to be outside the store at a certain hour, and wait until I found an opportunity to pass the money to them. My mother watched in the store that evening, but when she turned her back, I opened the till and gave the $8 or $10 it contained to the waiting boys. We all went rowboating and had a jolly time. But they were not satisfied with that. What I had done once, I could do again, and they held out the theater to me and pretended to teach me how to dance the clog. Week in and week out, I furnished them with money, and in recompense they would sometimes take me to a matinee. What a joy! How I grew to love the vaudeville artists with their songs and dances, and the wild Bowery melodramas. It was a great day for Indian plays, and the number of Indians I have scalped in imagination after one of these shows is legion. Some of the small boys, however, who did not share in the booty, grew jealous, and told my father what was doing. The result was that a certain part of my body was sore for weeks afterwards. My feelings were hurt, too, for I did not know at the time that I was doing anything very bad. My father, indeed, accompanied the beating with a sermon, telling me that I had not only broken God's law, but had robbed those that loved me. One of my brothers, who is now a policeman in the city service, told me that I had taken my ticket for the gallows. The brother I had robbed, who afterwards became a truckman, patted me on the head and told me not to do it again. He was always a good fellow. And yet, they all seemed to like to have me play about the streets with the other little boys, perhaps because the family was so large and there was not much room in the house. So I had to give up the till, but I hated to, for even at that age I had begun to think that the world owed me a living. To get revenge, I used to hide in a charcoal shed and throw pebbles at my father as he passed. I was indeed the typical bad boy and the apple of my mother's eye. When I couldn't steal from the till any more, I used to take clothes from my relatives and sell them for theater money, or any other object I thought I could make away with. I did not steal merely for theater money, but partly for excitement, too. I liked to run the risk of being discovered. So I was up to any scheme the older boys proposed. Perhaps if I had been raised in the Wild West, I should have made a good trapper or cowboy instead of a thief. Or perhaps even birds' nests and fish would have satisfied me if they had been accessible. One of my biggest exploits as a small boy was made when I was 8 years old. Tom's mother had a friend visiting her whom Tom and I thought we would rob. Tom, who was a big boy, and some of his friends, put me through a hall bedroom window, and I made away with a box of valuable jewelry. But it did me no good, for the big boys sold it to a woman who kept a second-hand store on Division Street, and I received no part of the proceeds. My greatest youthful disappointment came about 4 weeks later. A boy put me up to steal a box out of a wagon. I boldly made away with it and ran into a hallway where he was waiting. The two of us then went into his backyard, opened the box, and found a beautiful sword, the handle studded with little stones. But the other boy had promised me money, and here was only a sword. I cried for theater money, and then the other boy boxed my ears. He went to his father, who was a Freemason, and got a 50-cent stamp. He gave me 2 3-cent pieces and kept the rest. I shall never forget that injustice as long as I live. I remember it as plainly as if it happened yesterday. We put the sword under a mill in Cherry Street, and it disappeared a few hours later. I thought the boy and his father had stolen it, and told them so. I got another beating, but I believe my suspicion was correct, for the Freemason used to give me a 10-cent stamp whenever he saw me, to square me, I suppose. When it came to contests with boys of my own size, I was not so meek, however. One day I was playing in Jersey, in the backyard of a boy friend's house. He displayed his penknife, and it took my fancy. I wanted to play with it and asked him to lend it to me. He refused, and I grabbed his hand. He plunged the knife into my leg. I didn't like that, and told him so, not in words, but in action. I remember that I took his ear nearly off with a hatchet. I was then 8 years old. About this time I began to go to Sunday school, with what effect on my character remains to be seen. One day I heard a noted priest preach. I had $1.80 in my pocket, which I had stolen from my brother. I thought that each coin in my pocket was turning red hot because of my anxiety to spend it. While the good man was talking to the Blessed One, I was inwardly praying for him to shut up. He had 2 beautiful pictures, which he intended to give to the best listener among the boys. When he had finished his talk, he called me to him, gave me the pictures, and said, "It's such boys as you, who when they grow up, are a pride to our holy church." A year later I went to the parochial school, but did not stay for long, for they would not have me. I was a skeptic at 7 and an agnostic at 8, and I objected to the prayers every 5 minutes. I had no respect for ceremonies. They did not impress my imagination in the slightest, partly because I learned at an early age to see the hypocrisy of many good people. One day, 6 persons were killed in an explosion. One of them I had known. Neighbors said of him, "What a good man is gone," and the priest and my mother said he was in heaven. But he was the same man who had often told me not to take money from the money drawer, for that was dangerous, but to search my father's pockets when he was asleep. For this advice I had given the rascal many a dollar. Ever after that, I was suspicious of those who were over-virtuous. I told my mother I did not believe her and the priest, and she slapped my face and told me to mind my catechism. Everything mischievous that happened at the parochial school was laid to my account, perhaps not entirely unjustly. If a large firecracker exploded, it was James. That was my name. If someone sat on a bent pin, the blame was due to James. If the class tittered, Teacher Nolan would rush at me with a hickory stick and yell, "It's you, you devil's imp!" And then he'd put the question he had asked 100 times before, "Who made you?" I was finally sent away from the parochial school because I insulted one of the teachers, a Catholic brother. I persisted in disturbing him whenever he studied his catechism, which I believed he already knew by heart. This brother's favorite, by the way, was a boy who used to say his prayers louder than anybody else. I met him 15 years afterwards in state prison. He had been settled for Vogel grafting, that is, taking little girls into hallways and robbing them of their gold earrings. He turned out pretty well, however, in one sense, for he became one of the best shoemakers in Sing Sing. Although, as one can see from the above incidents, I was not given to veneration, yet in some ways I was easily impressed. I always loved old buildings, for instance. I was baptized in the building which until lately was the Germania Theatre, and which was then a church, and that old structure always had a strange fascination for me. I used to hang about old churches and theatres, and preferred on such occasions to be alone. Sometimes I sang and danced all by myself in an old music hall, and used to pore over the names marked in lead pencil on the walls. Many is the time I have stood at night before some old building which has since been razed to the ground, and even now I like to go around to their sites. I like almost anything that is old, even old men and women. I never loved my mother much until she was an old woman. All stories of the past interested me, and later, when I was in prison, I was specially fond of history. After I was dismissed from the parochial school, I entered the public school, where I stayed somewhat longer. There I studied reading, writing, arithmetic, and later grammar, and became acquainted with a few specimens of literature. I remember Longfellow's Excelsior was a favorite of mine. I was a bright, intelligent boy, and, if it had not been for conduct, in which my mark was low, I should always have had the gold medal, in a class of 70. I used to play truant constantly, and often went home and told my mother that I knew more than the teacher. She believed me, for certainly I was the most intelligent member of my family. Yes, I was more intelligent than my parents or any of my brothers and sisters. Much good it has done me. Now that I've squared it, I see a good deal of my family, and they're all happy in comparison with me. On Saturday nights I often go around to see my brother, the truckman. He's come home tired from his week's work, but happy with his $12 salary and the prospect of a holiday with his wife and children. They sit about in their humble home on a Saturday night with their pint of beer, their songs, and their jovial stories. Whenever I'm there, I am in a way the life of the party. My repartee is quicker than that of the others. I sing gayer songs, and am jollier with the working girls who visit my brother's free home. But when I look at my stupid brother's quiet face and calm and strong bearing, and then realize my own shattered health and nerves and profound discontent, I know that my slow brother has been wiser than I. It's taken me many years on the rocky path to realize this truth. For by nature I am an Ishmaelite, that is, a man of impulse, and it is only lately that wisdom has been knocked into me. Certainly I did not realize my fate when I was a kid of 10, filled with contempt for my virtuous and obscure family. I was overflowing with spirits and arrogance, and began to play hooky so often that I practically quit school about this time. It was then, too, that we moved again, this time to Cherry Street, to the wreck of my life. At the end of the block on which we lived was a corner saloon, the headquarters of a band of professional thieves. They were known as the Old Border Gang, and among them were several well-known and successful crooks. They used to pass our way regularly, and boys older than I, and my boy companions always had the advantage of me in years, used to point the famous guns out to me. When I saw one of these great men pass, my young imagination was fired with the ambition to be as he was. With what eagerness we used to talk about Juggy and the daring robbery committed in Brooklyn. How we went over again and again in conversation the trick by which Johnny the grafter had fooled the detective in the matter of the bonds. We would tell stories like these by the hour, and then go round to the corner to try to get a look at some of the celebrities in the saloon. A splendid sight one of these swell grafters was, as he stood before the bar or smoked his cigar on the corner. Well dressed, with clean linen collar and shirt, a diamond in his tie, an air of ease and leisure all about him, what a contrast he formed to the respectable hod carrier or truckman or mechanic, with soiled clothes and no collar. And what a contrast was his dangerous life to that of the virtuous laborer. The result was that I grew to think the career of the grafter was the only one worth trying for. The real prizes of the world I knew nothing about. All that I saw of any interest in me was crooked, and so I began to pilfer right and left. There was nothing else for me to do. Besides, I loved to treat those older than myself. The theater was a growing passion with me, and I began to be very much interested in the baseball games. I used to go to the Union grounds in Brooklyn, where after the third inning I could usually get admitted for 15 cents to see the old Athletics and Mutuals play. I needed money for these amusements, for myself and other boys, and I knew of practically only one way to get it. If we could not get the money at home, either by begging or stealing, we would tap tills, if possible, in the store of some relative, or tear brass off the steps in the halls of flats and sell it at junk shops. A little later, we used to go to Grand Street and steal shoes and women's dresses from the racks in the open stores and pawn them. In the old Seventh Ward there used to be a good many silver plates on the doors of private houses. These we would take off with chisels and sell to metal dealers. We had great fun with a Dutchman who kept a grocery store on Cherry Street. We used to steal his strawberries and did not care whether he saw us or not. If he grabbed one of us, the rest of the gang would pelt him with stones until he let go, and then all run around the corner before the copper came into sight. All this time I grew steadily bolder and more desperate, and the day soon came when I took consequences very little into consideration. My father and mother sometimes learned of some exploit of mine, and a beating would be the result. I still got the blame for everything, as in school, and was sometimes punished unjustly. I was very sensitive, and this would rankle in my soul for weeks, so that I stole harder than ever. And yet I think that there was some good in me. I was never cruel to any animals except cats. For cats I used to tie the tails together and throw them over a clothesline to dry. I like dogs, horses, children, and women, and have always been gentle to them. What I really was a healthy young animal with a vivid imagination and a strong body. I learned early to swim and fight and play baseball. Dime and nickel novels always seemed very tame to me. I found it much more exciting to hear true stories about the grafters at the corner saloon, big men with whom as yet I did not dare to speak. I could only stare at them with awe. I shall never forget the first time I ever saw a pickpocket at work. It was when I was about 13 years old. A boy my own age, Zack, a great pal of mine, was with me. Zack and I understood one another thoroughly, and well knew how to get theater money by petty pilfering, but of real graft we were as yet ignorant, although we had heard many stories about the operations of actual professional thieves. We used to steal rides in the cars which ran to and from the Grand Street ferries, and run off with overcoats and satchels when we had a chance. One day we were standing on the rear platform when a woman boarded the car, and immediately behind her a gentlemanly-looking man with a high hat. He was well dressed and looked about 35 years old. As the lady entered the car, the man, who stayed outside on the platform, pulled his hand away from her side, and with it came something from her pocket, a silk handkerchief. I was on the point of asking the woman if she had dropped something, when Zack said to me, "Mind your own business." The man, who had taken the pocketbook along with the silk handkerchief, seeing that we were next, gave us the handkerchief and $4 in 10 and 15-cent paper money, stamps. Zack and I put our heads together. We were wiser than we had been a half an hour before. We had learned our first practical lesson in the world of graft. We had seen a pickpocket at work, and there seemed to us no reason why we should not try the game ourselves. Accordingly, a day or two afterwards we arranged to pick our first pocket. We had indeed often taken money from the pockets of our relatives, but that was when the trousers hung in the closet or over a chair, and the owner was absent. This was the first time we had hunted in the open, so to speak, the first time our prey was really alive. It was an exciting occasion. Zack and I, who were wise, that is, up to snuff, got several other boys to help us, though we did not tell them what was doing, for they were not buried yet, that is, dead or ignorant. We induced 5 or 6 of them to jump on and off the rear platform of a car, making as much noise and confusion as possible, so as to distract the attention of any sucker that might board. Soon I saw a woman about to get on the car. My heart beat with excitement, and I signaled to Zack that I would make the touch. In those days women wore big sacks with pockets in the back, open, so that one could look in and see what was there. I took the silk handkerchief on the run, and with Zack following, went up a side street and gloried under a lamp post. In the corner of the handkerchief, tied up, were 5 $2 bills, and for weeks I was J.P. Morgan. For a long time Zack and I felt we were the biggest boys on the block. We boasted about our great touch to the older boys of 18 and 19 years of age who had pointed out to us the grafters at the corner saloon. They were not in it now. They even condescended to be treated to a drink by us. We spent the money recklessly, for we knew where we could get more. In this state of mind, soon after that, I met the pick, whom we had seen at work. He had heard of our achievement and kindly staked us, and gave us a few private lessons in picking pockets. He saw that we were promising youngsters, and for the sake of the profession gave us a little of his valuable time. We were proud enough to be taken notice of by this great man. We felt that we were rising in the world of graft, and began to wear collars and neckties. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Autobiography of a Thief. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Autobiography of a Thief by Hutchins Hapgood. Chapter 2. My First Fall. For the next 2 years, until I was 15, I made a great deal of money at picking pockets, without getting into difficulties with the police. We operated at that time entirely upon women, and were consequently known technically as mall buzzers, or flies that buzz about women. In those days, and for several years later, mall buzzing, as well as picking pockets in general, was an easy and lucrative graft. Women's dresses seemed to be arranged for our especial benefit. The back pocket, with its purse and silk handkerchief, could be picked even by the rawest thief. It was in the days when every woman had to possess a fine silk handkerchief. Even the Bowery cruisers, street walkers, carried them, and to those women we boys used to sell the handkerchiefs we had stolen, receiving as much as $1 or even $2 in exchange. It was a time, too, before the great department stores and delivery wagon systems, and shoppers were compelled to carry more money with them than they do now, and to take their purchases home themselves through the streets. Very often before they reached their destination, they had unconsciously delivered some of the goods to us. At that time, too, the wearing of valuable pins and stones, both by men and women, was more general than it is now. Furthermore, the graft was younger. There were not so many in the business, and the system of police protection was not so good. Altogether, those were halcyon days for us. The fact that we were very young helped us particularly in this business, for a boy can get next to a woman in a car or on the street more easily than a man can. He is not so apt to arouse her suspicions, and if he is a handsome, innocent-looking boy and clever, he can go far in this line of graft. He usually begins this business when he is about 13, and by the age of 17 generally graduates into something higher. Living off women in any form does not appeal very long to the imagination of the genuine grafter. Yet I know thieves who continue to be mall buzzers all their lives, and who are low enough to make their living entirely off poor working girls. The self-respecting grafter detests this kind, and indeed, these buzzers never see prosperous days after their boyhood. The business grows more difficult as the thief grows older. He cannot approach his prey so readily, and grows shabbier with declining returns, and shabbiness makes it difficult for him to mix up in crowds where this kind of work is generally done. For several years we youngsters made a great deal of money at this line. We made a touch almost every day, and I suppose our mob, composed of 4 or 5 lads who worked together, averaged $300 or $400 a week. We worked mainly on street cars at the ferry, and the amount of technique required for robbing women was very slight. 2 or 3 of us generally went together. One acted as the dip, or pick, and the other 2 as stalls. The duty of the stalls was to distract the attention of the sucker, or victim, or otherwise to hide the operations of the dip. One stall would get directly in front of the woman to be robbed, the other directly behind her. If she were in such a position in the crowd as to render it hard for the dip or wire to make a touch, one of the stalls might bump against her and beg her pardon, while the dip made away with her leather or pocketbook. Shortly before I was 15 years old I was led into another kind of graft. One day Tim, Zack and I were boasting of our earnings to an older boy, 20 years of age, whose name was Pete. He grinned and said he knew something better than mall buzzing. Then he told us about shoving the queer, and got us next to a public truckman who supplied counterfeit bills. Our method was to carry only one bad bill among several good ones, so that if we were collared we could maintain our innocence. We worked this as a side graft for some time. Pete and I used to go to mass on Sunday morning, and put a bad $5 bill in the collector's box, taking out $4.90 in change in good money. We irreverently called this proceeding robbing the Dago in Rome. We used to pick leathers at the same time from the women in the congregation. In those days I was very liberal in my religious views. I was not narrow or bigoted. I attended Grace Church in 10th Street regularly, and was always well repaid. But after a while this lucrative graft came to an end, for the collector began to get next. One day he said to me, "Why don't you get your change outside? This is the 4th time you have given me a big bill." So we got leery, suspicious, and quit. With my big rosy cheeks and bright eyes and complexion I suppose I looked in those days very holy and innocent, and used to work this graft for all it was worth. I remember how in church I used tracts or the Christian Advocate as stalls. I would hand them to a lady as she entered the church, and while doing so, pick her pocket. Even at the early age of 15 I began to understand that it was necessary to save money. If a thief wants to keep out of the pen, or stir (penitentiary), capital is necessary. The capital of a grafter is called spring money, for he may have to use it at any time in paying the lawyer who gets him off in case of an arrest, or in bribing the policeman or some other official. To spring is to escape from the clutches of the law. If a thief has not enough money to hire a mouthpiece, a criminal lawyer, he is in a bad way. He is greatly handicapped, and cannot jump out (steal) with any boldness. But I always had great difficulty in saving fall money, the same as spring money, that is, money to be used in case of a fall or arrest. My temperament was at fault. When I had a few $100s saved up I began to be troubled, not from a guilty conscience, but because I could not stand prosperity. The money burned a hole in my pocket. I was fond of all sorts of amusements, of treating, and of clothes. Indeed, I was very much of a dude, and this for 2 reasons. In the first place, I was naturally vain, and liked to make a good appearance. A still more substantial reason was that a good personal appearance is part of the capital of a grafter, particularly of a pickpocket. The world thinks that a thief is a dirty, disreputable looking object, next door to a tramp in appearance. But this idea is far from being true. Every grafter of any standing in the profession is very careful about his clothes. He is always neat, clean, and as fashionable as his income will permit. Otherwise he would not be permitted to attend large political gatherings, to sit on the platform, for instance, and would be handicapped generally in his crooked dealings with mankind. No advice to young men is more common in respectable society than to dress well. If you look prosperous, the world will treat you with consideration. This applies with even greater force to the thief. Keep up a front is the universal law of success, applicable to all grades of society. The first thing a grafter is apt to say to a pal whom he has not seen for a long time is, "You're looking good," meaning that his friend is well dressed. It is sure flattery, and if a grafter wants to make a borrow, he is practically certain of opening the negotiations with the stereotyped phrase, "You're looking good." For the only time you can get anything off a grafter is when you can make him think you are prosperous. But the great reason why I never saved much fall money was not booze or theaters or clothes. "Look for the woman" is a phrase, I believe, in good society, and it certainly explains a great deal of a thief's misfortunes. Long before I did anything in Graftdom but petty pilfering, I had begun to go with the little girls in the neighborhood. At that time they had no attraction for me, but I heard older boys say that it was a manly thing to lead girls astray, and I was ambitious to be not only a good thief, but a hard case generally. When I was 9 or 10 years old, I liked to boast of the conquests I had made among the little working girls of 14 or 15. We used to meet in the hallways of tenement houses, or at their homes, but there was no sentiment in the relations between us, at least on my part. My only pleasure in it was the delight of telling about it to my young companions. When I was 12 years old I met a girl for whom I had a somewhat different feeling. Nellie was a pretty blue-eyed little creature, or tidbit, as we used to say, who lived near my home on Cherry Street. I used to take her over on the ferry for a ride, or treat her to ice cream, and we were really chums, but when I began to make money I lost my interest in her, partly, too, because at that time I made the acquaintance of a married woman of about 25 years old. She discovered me one day in the hallway with Nellie, and threatened to tell the Holy Brother on us if I didn't fetch her a pint of beer. I took the beer to her room, and that began a relationship of perhaps a year. She used to stake me to a part of the money her husband, a working man, brought her every Saturday night. Although the girls meant very little to me until several years later, I nevertheless began when I was about 15 to spend a great deal of money on them. It was the thing to do, and I did it with a good grace. I used to take all kinds of working girls to the balls in Walhalla Hall in Orchard Street, or in Pythagoras or Beethoven halls, where many pretty little German girls of respectable families used to dance on Saturday nights. It was my pride to buy them things, clothes, pins, and to take them on excursions, for was I not a rising gun with money in my pocket? Money, however, that went as easily as it had come. Perhaps if I had been able to save money at that time I might not have fallen, that is, been arrested, so early. My first fall came, however, when I was 15 years old, and if I was not a confirmed thief already, I certainly was one by the time I left the Tombs, where I stayed 10 days. It happened this way. Zack and I were grafting, buzzing malls, with a pal named Jack, who afterwards became a famous burglar. He had just escaped from the Catholic Protectory, and told us his troubles. Instead of being alarmed, however, I grew bolder, for if Jack could beat the Protec in 3 months, I argued I could do it in 24 hours. We three ripped things open for some time, but one day we were grafting on 6th Avenue, just below 20th Street, when I fell for a leather. The sucker, a good-looking moll, was coming up the avenue. Her book, which looked fat, was sticking out of her skirt. I, who was the wire, gave Jack and Zack the tip, thief's cough, and they stalled, one in front, one behind. The girl did not blow, take alarm, and I got hold of the leather easily. It looked like a getaway, for no one on the sidewalk saw us. But as bad luck would have it, a negro coachman, standing in the street by the pavement, got next, and said to me, "What are you doing there?" I replied, "Shut up, and I'll give you $2." But he caught hold of me and shouted for the police. I passed the leather to Jack, who vamoosed. Zack hit the negro in the face, and I ran up 7th Avenue, but was caught by a policeman, and taken to the station house. On the way to the police station I cried bitterly, for after all I was only a boy. I realized for the first time that the way of the transgressor is hard. It was in the afternoon, and I spent the time until next morning at 10, when I was to appear before the magistrate, in a cell in the station house in the company of an old grafter. In the adjoining cells were drunkards, street walkers and thieves who had been lined up for the night, and I spent the long hours in crying and in listening to their indecent songs and jokes. The old grafter called to one of the Tenderloin girls that he had a kid with him who was arrested for mall buzzing. At this they all expressed their sympathy with me by saying that I would either be imprisoned for life or be hanged. They got me to sing a song, and I convinced them that I was tough. In the morning I was arraigned in the police court. As there was no stolen property on me, and as the sucker was not there to make a complaint, I was settled for assault only, and sent to the Tombs for 10 days. My experience in the Tombs may fairly be called, I think, the turning point of my life. It was there that I met the mob. I learned new tricks in the Tombs, and more than that, I began definitely to look upon myself as a criminal. The Tombs of 20 years ago was even less cheerful than it is at present. The boys' prison faced the women's prison, and between these two was the place where those sentenced to death were hanged. The boys knew when an execution was to take place, and we used to talk it over amongst ourselves. One man was hanged while I was there, and if anybody thinks that knowledge of such things helps to make boys seek the path of virtue, let him go forth into the world and learn something about human nature. On my arrival in the Tombs, Mrs. Hill, the matron, had me searched for tobacco, knives and matches, all of which were contraband. Then I was given a bath and sent into the corridor of the cells, where there were about 25 of the boys confined for various crimes, ranging from petty larceny to offenses of the gravest kind. On the second day I met 2 young dips, and we exchanged our experiences in the world of graft. I received my first lesson in the art of banging a super, that is, stealing a watch by breaking the ring with the thumb and forefinger, and thus detaching it from the chain. They were 2 of the best of the 6th Ward pickpockets, and we made a date to meet on the outside. Indeed, it was not many weeks after my release before I could bang a super, or get a man's front, watch and chain, as easily as I could relieve a Moll of her leather. As I look back upon the food these young boys received in the Tombs, it seems to me of the worst. Breakfast consisted of a chunk of poor bread and a cup of coffee made of burnt bread crust. At dinner we had soup, they said at least there was meat in it, bread and water, and supper was the same as breakfast. But we had one consolation. When we went to divine service we generally returned happy, not because of what the good priest said, but because we were almost sure of getting tobacco from the women inmates. Certainly the Gerry Society has its faults, but since its organization young boys who have gone wrong but are not yet entirely hardened have a much better show to become good citizens than they used to have. That society did not exist in my day, but I know a good deal about it, and I am convinced that it does a world of good. For at least when it takes children into its charge it does not surround them with an atmosphere of social crime. While in the Tombs I experienced my first disillusionment as to the honor of thieves. I was an impulsive, imaginative boy, and that a pal could go back on me never seemed possible. Many of my subsequent misfortunes were due to the treachery of my companions. I have learned to distrust everybody, but as a boy of 15 I was green, and so the treachery I shall relate left a sore spot in my soul. It happened this way. On a May day, about 2 months before I was arrested, 2 other boys and I had entered the basement of a house where the people were moving, had made away with some silverware, and sold it to a Christian woman in the neighborhood for 1/20th of its value. When I had nearly served my 10 days' sentence for assault, my 2 pals were arrested and squealed on me. I was confronted with them in the Tombs. At first I was mighty glad to see them, but when I found they had squealed, I set my teeth and denied all knowledge of the touch. I protested my innocence so violently that the police thought the other boys were merely seeking a scapegoat. They got 20 days, and my term expired 48 hours afterwards. The silverware I stole that May morning is now an heirloom in the family of the Christian woman to whom I sold it so cheap. If I had always been as earnest a liar as I was on that occasion in the Tombs, I might never have gone to stir penitentiary. But I grew more indifferent and desperate as time went on, and, in a way, more honest, more sincerely a criminal. I hardly felt like denying it. I know some thieves who, although they have grafted for 25 years, have not yet done time. Some of them escaped because they knew how to throw the innocent con so well. Take Tim, for instance. Tim and I grafted together as boys. He was not a very skillful pickpocket, and he often was on the point of arrest. But he had a talent for innocence, and the indignation act he would put up would melt a heart of stone. He has consequently never been in stir, while I, a much better thief, have spent half my adult life there. That was partly because I felt, when I had once made a touch, that the property belonged to me. On one occasion I had robbed a bloke of his red super, gold watch, and made away with it all right when I carelessly dropped it on the sidewalk. A crowd had gathered about, and no man really in his right mind would have picked up that super. But I did it, and was nailed dead to rights by a cop. Some time afterwards a pal asked me why the deuce I had been so foolish. Didn't the super belong to me, I replied indignantly. Hadn't I earned it? I was too honest a thief. That was one of my weaknesses. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of the Autobiography of a Thief. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Autobiography of a Thief by Hutchins Hapgood. Chapter 3. Mixed-ale Life in the 4th and 7th Wards. For a time, a short time, after I left the Tombs, I was quiet. My relatives threw the gallows con into me hard, but at that time I was proof against any arguments they could muster. They were not able to show me anything that was worth while. They could not deliver the goods, so what was the use of talking? Although I was a disgrace at home, I was high cockalorum among the boys in the neighborhood. They began to look up to me, as I had looked up to the grafters at the corner saloon. They admired me because I was a fighter and had done time. I went up in their estimation because I had suffered in the good cause. And I began to get introductions to the older grafters in the 7th Ward, grafters with diamond pins and silk hats. It was not long before I was at it harder than ever, uptown and downtown. I not only continued my trade as a Moll buzzer, but began to spread myself, got to be quite an adept in touching men for vests and supers and fronts, and every now and then shoved the queer, or worked a little game of swindling. Our stamping ground for supers and vests at that time was Fulton, Nassau, Lower Broadway and Wall Streets, and we covered our territory well. I used to work alone considerably. I would board a car with a couple of newspapers and would say "News, boss," to some man sitting down, and would shove the paper in front of his face as a stall, and then pick his super, or even his entire front, watch and chain. If you will stand for a newspaper under your chin, I can even get your socks. Many is the gent I have left in the car with his vest entirely unbuttoned and his front gone. When I couldn't get the chain, I would snap the ring of the watch with my thumb and forefinger, giving the thief's cough to drown the slight noise made by the breaking ring, and get away with the watch, leaving the chain dangling. Instead of a newspaper, I would often use an overcoat as a stall. It was only when I was on the hurry up, however, that I worked alone. It's more dangerous than working with a mob. But if I needed $1 quick, I'd take any risk. I'd jump on a car and tackle the first sucker I saw. If I thought it was not diplomatic to try for the front, and if there was no stone in sight, I'd content myself with the clock. Watch. But it was safer and more sociable to work with other guys. We usually went in mobs of 3 or 4, and our methods were much more complicated than when we were simply Moll buzzing. Each thief had his special part to play, and his duty varied with the position of the sucker and the pocket the leather was in. If the sucker was standing in the car, my stall would frequently stand right in front of him, facing him, while I would put my hand under the stall's arm and pick the sucker's leather or super. The other stalls would be distracting the attention of the sucker or looking out for possible interruptions. When I had got possession of the leather, I would pass it quickly to the stall behind me, and he would vamoose. Sometimes I would back up to the victim, put my hand behind me, break his ring, and pick the super. Or I would face his back, reach round, unbutton his vest while a pal stalled in front with a newspaper, a bunch of flowers, a fan, or an overcoat, and get away with his entire front. A dip, as I have said, pays special attention to his personal appearance. It is his stock in trade. But when I began to meet boys who had risen above the grade of Moll buzzers, I found that the dip, as opposed to other grafters, had many other advantages, too. He combines pleasure and instruction with business, for he goes to the football games, the New London races, to swell theaters where the graft is good, and to lectures. I have often listened to Bob Ingersoll, the greatest orator, in my opinion, that ever lived. I enjoyed his talk so much that I sometimes forgot to graft. But, as a general rule, I was able to combine instruction with business. I very seldom dropped a red super because of an oratorical flourish, but the supers did not come my way all the time. I had some waiting to do, and in the meantime I improved my mind. Then a dip travels, too, more than other grafters. He jumps out to fairs and large gatherings of all descriptions, and grows to be a man of the world. When in the city he visits the best dance halls, and is popular because of his good clothes, his dough, and his general information, with men as well as women. He generally lives with a moll who has seen the world, and who can add to his fund of information. I know a dip who could not read or write until he met a moll, who gave him a general education and taught him to avoid things that interfered with his line of graft. She also took care of his personal appearance, and equipped him generally for an A No. 1 pickpocket. Women are much the same, I believe, in every rank of life. It was at this time, when I was a kid of 15, that I first met Sheenie Annie, who was a famous shoplifter. She was 21 years old and used to give me good advice. "Keep away from heavy workers (burglars)," she would say. "There is a big bit in that." She had lived in Grafton ever since she was a tidbit, and she knew what she was talking about. I did not work with her until several years later, but I might as well tell her sad story now. I may say, as a kind of preface, that I have always liked the girl grafter who could take care of herself, instead of sucking the blood out of some man. When I find a little working girl who has no other ambition than to get a little home together, with a little knick-knack on the wall, a little husband, and a little child, I don't care for her. She is a nonentity. But such was not Sheenie Annie, who was a bright, intelligent, ambitious girl. When she liked a fellow she would do anything for him, but otherwise she wouldn't let a man come near her. The little Jewish lassie named Annie was born in the toughest part of New York. Later on, as she advanced in years and became an expert pilferer, she was given the nickname of Sheenie. She was brought up on the street, surrounded by thieves and prostitutes. Her only education was what she received during a year or two in the public school. She lived near Grand Street, then a popular shopping district. As a very little girl she and a friend used to visit the dry goods stores and steal any little notion they could. There was a crowd of young pickpockets in her street, and she soon got onto this graft, and became so skillful at it that older guns of both sexes were eager to take her under their tuition and finish her education. The first time I met her was in a well-known dance hall, Billy McGlory's, and we became friends at once, for she was a good girl and full of mischief. She was not pretty exactly, but she was passable. She was small, with thick lips, plump, had good teeth, and eyes as fine and piercing as any I ever saw in man or woman. She dressed well, and was a good talker, as nimble-witted and as good a judge of human nature as I have ever met in her sex. Sheenie Annie's graft broadened, and from dipping and small shoplifting she rose to a position where she doubled up with a mob of clever hotel workers, and made large amounts of money. Here was a girl from the lowest stratum of life, not pretty or well shaped, but whom men admired because of her wit and cleverness. A big contractor in Philadelphia was her friend for years. I've seen letters from him offering to marry her, but she had something better. For she was an artist at penny weighting and hoisting. The police admitted that she was unusually clever at these two grafts, and they treated her with every consideration. Penny weighting is a very slick graft. It's generally worked in pairs, by either sex or both sexes. A man, for instance, enters a jewelry store and looks at some diamond rings on a tray. He prices them and notes the costly ones. Then he goes to a phony shop, imitation jewelry, and buys a few diamonds which match the real ones he has noted. Then he and his pal, usually a woman, enter the jewelry store and ask to see the rings. Through some little con they distract the jeweler's attention, and then one of them, and at this Sheenie Annie was particularly good, substitutes the bogus diamonds for the good ones, and leaves the store without making a purchase. I can give an example of how Sheenie Annie hoisted from my own experience with her. On one occasion, when I was about 18 years old, Sheenie and I were on a racket together. We'd been going it for several days and needed some dough. We went into a large tailoring establishment, where I tried on some clothes as a stall. Nothing suited me, I took good care of that, but in the meantime Annie had taken 2 costly overcoats, folded them into flat bundles, and raising her skirt quickly, had hidden the overcoats between her legs. We left the store together. She walked so straight that I thought she had got nothing, but when we entered a saloon a block away and the swag was produced, I was forced to laugh. We fenced the overcoats, and with the proceeds continued our spree. Once Sheenie fell at this line of graft. She had stolen some costly sealskins from a well-known furrier, and had got away with them. But on her third visit to the place, she came to grief. She was going out with a sealskin coat under her skirt when the office boy, who was skylarking about, ran into her and upset her. When the salesman, who had gone to her rescue, lifted her up, she lost her grip on the sealskin sack and it fell to the floor. It was a blow, of course, and she got nailed, but as she had plenty of fall money and a well-known politician dead to rights, she only got 9 months in the penitentiary. Sheenie Annie was such a good shoplifter that, with only an umbrella as a stall, she could make more money in a week than a poor needlewoman could earn in months. But she did not care for the money. She was a good fellow and was in for fun. She was wise, too, and I liked to talk to her, for she understood what I said and was up to snuff, which was very piquant to me. She had done most of the grafts that I had done myself, and her tips were always valuable. To show what a good fellow she was, her sweetheart, Jack, and another burglar named Jerry were doing night work once, when they were unlucky enough to be nailed. Sheenie Annie went on the stand and swore perjury in order to save Jack. He got a year, but Jerry, who had committed the same crime, got 6. While he was in prison, Annie visited him and put up a plan by which he escaped, but he would not leave New York with her, and was caught and returned to stir. Annie herself fell in half a dozen cities, but never received more than a few months. After I was released from serving my second bit in the pen, I heard Annie had died insane. An old girl pal of hers told me that she had died a horrible death, and that her last words were about her old friends and companions. Her disease was that which attacks only people with brains. She died of paresis. 2 other girls whom I knew when I was 15 turned out to be famous shoplifters, Big Lena and Blonde Mamie, who afterwards married Tommy, the famous cracksman. They began to graft when they were about 14, and Mamie and I used to work together. I was Mamie's first fella, and we had royal good times together. Lena, poor girl, is now doing 5 years in London, but she was one of the most cheerful molls I ever knew. I met her and Mamie for the first time one day as they were coming out of an oyster house on Grand Street. I thought they were good-looking tidbits, and took them to a picnic. We were so late that instead of going home, Mamie and I spent the night at the house of Lena's sister, whose husband was a receiver of stolen goods, or fence, as it is popularly called. In the morning, Lena, Mamie and I made our first touch together. We got a few books uptown, and Mamie banged a satchel at Stern's. After that, we often jumped out together, and took in the excursions. Sometimes Mamie or Lena would dip and I would stall, but more frequently I was the pick. We used to turn our swag over to Lena's sister's husband, Max, who would give us about 1/6 of its value. These 3 girls certainly were a crackerjack trio. You couldn't find their likes nowadays. Even in my time, most of the girls I knew did not amount to anything. They generally married or did worse. There were few legitimate grafters among them. Since I have been back this time, I have seen so many of the old picks and night workers I used to know. They tell the same story. There are no molls now who can compare with Big Lena, Blonde Mamie, and Sheenie Annie. Times are bad, anyway. After my experience in the Tombs, I rose very rapidly in the world of graft, and distanced my old companions. Zack, the lad with whom I had touched my first moll, soon seemed very tame to me. I fell away from him because he continued to eat bolivers (cookies), patronized the free baths, and stole horse blankets and other trivial things when he could not get leathers. He was not fast enough for me. Zack got there, nevertheless, and for little or nothing, for several years later I met him in State's prison. He told me he was going to Colorado on his release. I again met him in prison on my second bit. He was then going to Chicago. On my third hit I ran up against the same old jailbird, but this time his destination was Boston. Today he's still in prison. As I fell away from the softies, I naturally joined hands with more ambitious grafters, and with those with brains and with good connections in the upper world. As a lad of from 15 to 18, I associated with several boys who are now famous politicians in this city, and on the level, as that phrase is usually meant. Jack Lawrence was a well-educated boy, and high up as far as his family was concerned. His father and brothers held good political positions, and it was only a taste for booze and for less genteel grafting that held Jack back. As a boy of 16 or 17, he was the trusted messenger of a well-known Republican politician named J.I.D. One of Jack's pals became a federal judge, and another, Mr. D., who was never a grafter, is at present a city magistrate in New York. While Jack was working for J.I.D., the politician, he was arrested several times. Once he abstracted a large amount of money from the vest pocket of a broker as he was standing by the old Herald building. He was nailed and sent word to his employer, the politician, who went to police headquarters, highly indignant at the arrest of his trusted messenger. He easily convinced the broker and the magistrate that Jack was innocent, and as far as the Republican politician's business was concerned, Jack was honest, for J.I.D. trusted him, and Jack never deceived him. There are some thieves who will not touch those who place confidence in them, and Jack was one of them. After he was released, the following conversation, which Jack related to me, took place between him and the politician, in the latter's office. "How was it," the big one said, "that you happened to get your fingers into that man's pocket?" Jack gave the innocent con. "None of that," said J.I.D., who was a wise guy. "I know you have a habit of taking small change from strangers' pockets." Jack then came off his perch and gave the patron a lesson in the art of throwing the mitt dipping. At this the politician grinned and remarked, "You will either become a reputable politician, for you have the requisite character, or you will die young." Jack was feared, hated and envied by the other young fellows in J.I.D.'s office, for, as he was such a thorough rascal, he was a great favorite with those high up. But he never got J.I.D.'s full confidence until after he was tested in the following way. One day the politician put his gold watch on a table in his office. Jack saw it, picked it up, and put it in the big one's drawer. The latter entered the room, saw that the watch was gone, and said, "I forgot my watch. I must have left it at home." "No," said Jack, "you left it on the table, and I put it in your desk." A smile spread over the patron's face. "Jack, I can trust you. I put it there just to test your honesty." The boy hesitated a moment, then, looking into the man's face, replied, "I know right well you did, for you're a wise guy." After that, J.I.D. trusted Jack even with his love affairs. As Jack advanced in life he became an expert gun, and was often nailed and frequently brought before Magistrate D., his old friend. He always got the benefit of the doubt. One day he was arraigned before the magistrate, who asked the flyman the nature of the complaint. It was the same as usual, dipping. Jack, of course, was indignant at such an awful accusation, but the magistrate told him to keep still, and turning to the policeman, asked the culprit's name. When the copper told him, the magistrate exclaimed, "Why, that's not his name. I knew him 20 years ago, and he was a damned rascal then, but that was not his name." Jack was shocked at such language from the bench, and swore with such vehemence that he was innocent, that he once again got the benefit of the doubt, and was discharged, and this time justly, for he had not made this particular touch. He was hounded by a copper looking for a reputation. Jack, when he was set free, turned to the magistrate and said, "Your Honor, I thank you, but you only did your duty to an innocent man." The magistrate had a good laugh and remarked, "Jack, I wouldn't believe you if you swore on a stack of Bibles." A curious trait in a professional grafter is that if he is pinched for something he did not do, although he has done 100 other things for which he has never been pinched, he will put up such a wail against the abominable injustice that an honest man accused of the same offense would seem guilty in comparison. The honest man, even if he has the ability of a Philadelphia lawyer, could not do the strong indignation act that is characteristic of the unjustly accused grafter. Old thieves guilty of 1,000 crimes will nourish revenge for years against the copper or judge who sends them up to stir on a false accusation. When I was from 15 to 17 years old, I met the man who some think is now practically leader of Tammany Hall. I will call him Senator Wet Coin. At that time he was a boy 18 or 19, and strictly on the level. He knew all the grafters well, but kept off the rocky path himself. In those days he hung out in an oyster shanty and ran a paper stand. It's said he materially assisted Mr. Pulitzer in making a success of the World when that paper was started. He never drank, in spite of the name I have given him. In fact, he derived his real nickname from his habit of abstinence. He was the friend of a Bowery girl who is now a well-known actress. She, too, was always on the level in every way, although her brother was a grafter. This case, and that of Senator Wet Coin, proved that even in an environment of thieves it is possible to tread the path of virtue. Wet Coin would not even buy a stolen article, and his reward was great. He became captain of his election district, ran for assemblyman, was elected, and got as high a position, with the exception of that of governor, as is possible in the state, while in the city probably no man is more powerful. Senator Wet Coin made no pretensions to virtue. He never claimed to be better than others. But in spite of the accusations against him, he has done far more for the public good than all the professional reformers, religious and other. He took many noted and professional criminals in the prime of their success, gave them positions, and by his influence kept them honest ever since. Some of them are high up, even run gin mills today. I met one of them after my second bit, who used to make his thousands. Now he has a salary of $18 a week and is contented. I had known him in the old days, and he asked, "What are you doing?" "The same old thing," I admitted. "What are you up to?" "I've squared it, Jim," he replied earnestly. "There's nothing in the graft. Why don't you go to sea?" "I'd as lief go to stir," I replied. We had a couple of beers and a long talk, and this is the way he gave it to me. "I never thought I could live on $18 a week. I have to work hard, but I save more money than I did when I was making hundreds a week, for when it comes hard, it does not go so easy. I look twice at my earnings before I part with them. I live quietly with my sister, and am happy. There's nothing in the other thing, Jim. Look at Hope. Look at Dan Noble. Look at all the other noted grafters who stole millions, and now are willing to throw the brotherly hand for a small borrow. If I had the chance to make thousands tomorrow in the underworld, I would not chance it. I'm happy. Better still, I'm contented. Only for Mr. Wet Coin I'd be splitting matches in a stir these many years. Show me the reformer who has done as much for friends and the public as Wet Coin." A touch that pleased me mightily as a kid was made just before my second fall. Superintendent Walling had returned from a summer resort and found that a mob of knucks, another name for pickpockets, had been tearing open the Third Avenue cars outside of the post office. About 50 complaints had been coming in every day for several weeks, and the superintendent thought he would make a personal investigation and get one of the thieves dead to rights. He made a front that he was easy and went down the line. He did not catch any dips, but when he reached police headquarters he was minus his gold watch and $250 in money. The story leaked out, and Superintendent Walling was unhappy. There would never have been a comeback for this touch if an old gun, who had just been nailed, had not squealed as to who touched the boss. Little Mick had done it, and the result was that he got his first experience in the House of Refuge. It was only a short time after Little Mick's fall that it came my turn to go to the House of Refuge. I had grown tougher and much stuck on myself and was taking bigger risks. I certainly had a swelled head in those days. I was 17 years old at the time and was grafting with Jack T., who is now in Burns's book, and one of the swellest Peter men (safe blowers) in the profession. Jack and I, along with another pal, Joe Quigley, got a duffer, an Englishman, for his front, on Grant Street, near Broadway. It was a blow, and I, who was the wire, got nailed. If I had not given my age as 15, I should have been sent to the penitentiary. As it was, I went to the House of Refuge for a year. Joe Quigley slipped up on the same game. He was 20, but gave his age as 15. He had had a good shave by the Tombs barber. There was a false date of birth written in his aunt's Bible, which was produced in court by his lawyer, and he would probably have gone with me to the House of Refuge had not a Central Office man who knew him happened in. Joe was settled for 4 years in Sing Sing. When I arrived at the House of Refuge, my pedigree was taken and my hair clipped. Then I went into the yard, looked down the line of boys on parade, and saw about 40 young grafters whom I knew. One of them is now a policeman in New York City, and, moreover, on the level. Some others, too, but not many, who were then in the House of Refuge are now honest. Several are running big saloons and are captains of their election districts, or even higher up. These men are exceptions, however, for certainly the House of Refuge was a school for crime. Unspeakably bad habits were contracted there. The older boys wrecked the younger ones, who, comparatively innocent, confined for the crime of being orphans, came in contact with others entirely hardened. The daytime was spent in the school and the shop, but there was an hour or two for play, and the boys would arrange to meet for mischief in the basement. Severe punishments were given to lads of 15, and their tasks were harder than those inflicted in State's prison. We had to make 24 pairs of overalls every day, and if we did not do our work, we were beaten on an unprotected and tender spot until we promised to do our task. One morning I was made to cross my hands, and was given 15 blows on the palms with a heavy rattan stick. The crime I had committed was inattention. The principal had been preaching about the prodigal son. I, having heard it before, paid little heed, particularly as I was a Catholic and his teachings did not count for me. They called me a papist and beat me as I described. I say without hesitation that lads sent to an institution like the House of Refuge, the Catholic Protectory, or the Juvenile Asylum might better be taken out and shot. They learn things there they could not learn even in the streets. A newsboy's life is pure in comparison. As for me, I grew far more desperate there than I had been before, and I was far from being one of the most innocent of boys. Many of the others had more to learn than I had, and they learned it. But even I, hard as I already was, acquired much fresh information about vice and crime, and gathered in more pointers about the technique of graft. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Autobiography of a Thief. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Autobiography of a Thief by Hutchins Hapgood. Chapter 4. When the Graft was Good. I stayed in the House of Refuge until I was 18, and when released, went through a short period of reform. I lasted, I think, nearly 3 weeks, and then started into graft again, harder than ever. The old itch for excitement, for theaters, balls and gambling, made reform impossible. I had already formed strong habits and desires which could not be satisfied in my environment without stealing. I was rapidly becoming a confirmed criminal. I began to do housework, which was mainly sneak work uptown. We would catch a basement open in the daytime and rummage for silverware, money or jewels. There's only a step from this to the business of the genuine burglar, who operates in the night time, and whose occupation is far more dangerous than that of the sneak thief. However, at this intermediate kind of graft, our swag for 18 months was considerable. One of our methods was to take servant girls to balls and picnics, and to get them to tip us off to where the goods were and the best way to get them. Sometimes they were guilty, more often merely suckers. During the next 3 years, at the expiration of which I made my first trip to Sing Sing, I stole a great deal of money and lived very high. I contracted more bad habits, practically ceased to see my family at all, lived in a furnished room, and hung out in the evening at some dance hall, such as Billy McGlory's Old Armory, George Doe's, or Thee Allen's. Sheenie Annie was my sweetheart at this period, and after we had made a good touch, what times we would have at Coney Island or at Billy McGlory's. Saturday nights in the summertime, a mob of 3 or 4 of us, grafters and girls, would go to the island and stop at a hotel run by an ex-gun. At 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning we'd all leave the hotel, with nothing on but a quilt, and go in swimming together. Sheenie Annie, Blonde Mamie and Big Lena often went with us. At other times we took respectable shop girls, or even women who belonged to a still lower class. What boy with an ounce of thick blood in his body could refuse to go with a girl to the island? And Billy McGlory's, what times we had there on dear old Saturday nights! At this place, which contained a bar room, dance room, pool room and a piano, congregated downtown guns, housemen and thieves of both sexes. No ragtime was danced in those days, but early in the morning we had plenty of the can-can. The riots that took place there would put to shame anything that goes on now. Footnote: Summer of 1902. I never knew the town so tight shut as it is at present. It's far better from a moral point of view than it has ever been before, at least in my recollection. Thee Allen's was in those days a grade more decent than McGlory's, for at Thee's nobody who did not wear a collar and coat was admitted. I remember a pal of mine who met a society lady on a slumming expedition with a reporter. It was at McGlory's. The lady looked upon the grafter she had met as a novelty. The grafter looked upon the lady in the same way, but consented to write her an article on the Bowery. He sent her the following composition, which he showed to me first, and allowed me to copy it. I always did like freaks. I won't put in the bad grammar and spelling, but the rest is, quote, "While strolling after the midnight hour along the lane in that historic thoroughfare sometimes called the Bowery, I dropped into a concert hall. At a glance I saw men who worked hard during the week and needed a little recreation. Near them were their sisters, that is, if we all belonged to the same human family, who had fallen by the wayside. A man was trying to play a popular song on a squeaky piano, while another gent tried to sing the first part of the song, when the whole place joined in the chorus with a zest. I think the song was most appropriate. It was a ditty of the slums entitled "Dear Old Saturday Night." End quote. When I was about 19, I took another and important step in the world of graft. One night I met a couple of swell grafters, one of whom is at the present time a Pinkerton detective. They took me to the Haymarket, where I met a crowd of guns who were making barrels of money. Two of them, Dutch Lonzo and Charlie Allen, became my friends and introduced me to Mr. R., who has often kept me out of prison. He was a go-between, a lawyer, and well known to all good crooks. If we fell, we had to notify him, and he would set the underground wires working, with the result that our fall money would need replenishing badly, but that we'd escape the stir. That I was not convicted again for 3 years was entirely due to my fall money and to the cleverness of Mr. R. Besides these expenses, which I considered legitimate, I used to get shaken down regularly by the police and detectives. The following is a typical case. I was standing one day on the corner of Grand Street and the Bowery when a copper who knew me came up and said: "There's a lot of knocking (complaining) going on about the Grand Street cars being torn open. The old man (the chief) won't stand for it much longer." "It wasn't me," I said. "Well, it was one of the gang," he replied, "and I'll have to make an arrest soon or take someone to headquarters for his mug," that is, to have his picture taken for the Rogues Gallery. I knew what that meant, and so I gave him a $20 bill. But I was young, and often objected to these exorbitant demands. More than anybody else, a thief hates to be touched, for he despises the sucker on whom he lives. And we were certainly touched with great regularity by the coppers. Still, we really had nothing to complain of in those days, for we made plenty of money and had a good time. We even used to buy our collars, cuffs and gloves cheap from grafters who made it their business to steal those articles. They were cheap guns, pipe fiends, petty larceny thieves and shoplifters, but they helped to make our path smoother. After I met the Haymarket grafter, I used to jump out to neighboring cities on very profitable business. A good graft was to work the fairs at Danbury, Waverly, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and the football games at Princeton. I always traveled with 3 or 4 others, and went for gatherings where we knew we would find roofers or country gentlemen. On my very first jump out I got a fall, but the copper was open to reason. Dutch Lonzo and Charlie Allen, splendid pickpockets. I always went with good thieves, for I had become a first-class dip and had a good personal appearance. Were working with me in Newark, where Vice President Hendricks was to speak. I picked a watch in the crowd and was nailed. But Dutch Lonzo, who had the gift of gab better than any man I ever met, took the copper into a saloon. We all had a drink, and for $25 I escaped even the station house. Unfortunately, however, I was compelled to return the watch, for the copper had to square the sucker. Then the copper said to Dutch Lonzo, whom he knew, "Go back and graft if you want, but be sure to look me up." In an hour or two we got enough touches to do us for 2 weeks. Senator Wetcoin was at this speech with about 200 Tammany braves, and we picked so many pockets that a newspaper the next day said there must have been at least 199 pickpockets in the Tammany delegation. We fell quite often on these trips, but we were always willing to help the coppers pay for their lower flats. I sometimes objected because of their exorbitant demands, but I was still young. I knew that longshoremen did harder work for less pay than the coppers, and I thought, therefore, that the latter were too eager to make money on a sure thing graft, and I always hated a sure thing graft. But didn't we strike it rich in Connecticut? Whether the people of that state suffer from partial paralysis or not, I don't know, but certainly if all states were as easy as Connecticut, the guns would set up as Vanderbilts. I never even got a tumble in Connecticut. I ripped up the fares in every direction and took every chance. The inhabitants were so easy that we treated them with contempt. After a long trip in Connecticut, I nearly fell on my return. I was that raw. We were breech getting, picking men's pockets, in the Brooklyn cars. I was stalling in front, Lonzo was behind, and Charlie was the pick. Lonzo telephoned to me by gestures that Charlie had got hold of the leather, but it wouldn't come. I was hanging on a strap, and, pretending to slip, brought my hand down heavily on the sucker's hat, which went over his ears. The leather came, was slipped to me. Lonzo apologized for spoiling the hat, and offered the sucker a $5 bill, which he politely refused. Now that was rough work, and we would not have done it had we not been traveling so long among the Rubes in Connecticut. We could have made our gets all right, but we were so confident and delayed so long that the sucker blew before we left the car, and Lonzo and Charlie were nailed, and the next morning arraigned. In the meantime, however, we had started the wires working, and notified Mr. R. and Lonzo's wife to fix things in Brooklyn. The reliable attorney got a bondsman, and 2 friends of his fixed the cops, who made no complaint. Lonzo's wife, an Irishwoman and a handsome grafter, had just finished a 5-year bit in London. It cost us $600 to fix that case, and there were only $250 in the leather. That made Lonzo's wife exceedingly angry. "Good Lord," she said, "there's panthers for you in New York. There's blokes that shakes you down too heavy. I'd want an unlimited check on the Bank of England if you ever fell again." A little philosophy on the same subject was given me one day by an English moll, who had fallen up state and had to give up heavily. "I've been in a good many cities and hamlets in this country," said she, "but gad, blind me if I ever want to fall in an hamlet in this bloomin' state again. The New York police are at least a little sensible at times, but when these Rufuses up the state get a Yorker or a wise guy, they'll strip him down to his socks. One of these voracious country coppers who sing sweet hymns in jail is a more successful gun than them that hit the rocky path and take brash to get the long green. It's only the grafter is supposed to protect the people who makes a success of it. The hypocritical mouthings of these people just suit the size of their Bibles." Lonzo and I, and Patsy, a grafter I had picked up about this time, made several fat trips to Philadelphia. At first we were leery of the department stores, there had been so many hollers, and worked the rattlers cars only. We were told by some local guns that we could not last 24 hours in Philadelphia without protection, but that was not our experience. We went easy for a time, but the chances were too good, and we began voraciously to tear open the department stores, the churches and the theaters. And without a fall. Whenever anybody mentioned the fly cops, detectives, of Philadelphia, it reminded us of the inhabitants of Connecticut. They were not dead. Such a word is sacred. Their proper place was not on the police force, but on the shelf in a Dutchman's grocery store labeled the canned article. Philadelphia was always my town, but I never stayed very long, partly because I did not want to become known in such a fat place, and partly because I could not bear to be away from New York very long. For although there is better graft in other cities, there is no such place to live in as Manhattan. I had no fear of being known in Philadelphia to the police, but to local guns who would become jealous of our grafting and tip us off. On one of my trips to the city of brotherly love I had a poetical experience. The graft had been good, and one Sunday morning I left Dan and Patsy asleep and went for a walk in the country, intending for a change to observe the day of rest. I walked for several hours through a beautiful, quiet country, and about 10 o'clock passed a country church. They were singing inside, and for some reason, probably because I had had a good walk in the country, the music affected me strangely. I entered and saw a blind evangelist and his sister. I bowed my head, and my whole past life came over me. Although everything had been coming my way, I felt uneasy, and thought of home for the first time in many weeks. I went back to the hotel in Philadelphia feeling very gloomy, and shut myself up in my room. I took up my pen and began a letter to a Tommy girl in New York. But I could not forget the country church, and instead of writing to the little Tommy, I wrote the following jingles: "When a child by my mother's knee, I would watch, watch, watch by the deep blue sea, and the moonbeams played merrily on our home beside the sea." Chorus: "The evening star shines brightly above our home beside the sea, and the moonbeams danced beamingly on our home beside the sea. But now I am old, infirm and gray, I shall never see those happy days. I would give my life, all my wealth and fame, to hear my mother gently call my name." Towards evening Patsy and Dan returned from a good day's work. Patsy noticed I was quiet and unusually gloomy, and asked, "What's the matter? Didn't you get anything?" "No," I replied. "I'm going back to New York." "Where you been?" asked Dan. "To church," I replied. "In the city?" he asked. "No," I replied, "in the country." "I cautioned you," said Dan, "against taking such chances. There's no dough in those country churches. If you want to try lone ones on a Sunday, take in some swell church in the city." The following Sunday I went to a fashionable church and got a few leathers, and afterwards went to all the swell churches in the city. I touched them, but they could not touch me. I heard all the ministers in Philadelphia, but they could not move me the way that country evangelist did. They were all artificial in comparison. Shortly after my poetical experience in Philadelphia I made a trip up New York State with Patsy, Dan and Joe, and grafted in a dozen towns. One day when we were on the cars going from Albany to Amsterdam, we saw a fat, sleepy looking Dutchman, and I nicked him for a clock as he was passing along the aisle to the end of the car. It took the Dutchman about 10 minutes after he had returned to his seat to blow that his super was gone and his chain hanging down. A look of stupid surprise spread over his innocent countenance. He looked all around, picked up the end of his chain, saw it was twisted, put his hand in his vest pocket, and then looked again at the end of the chain, tried his pocket again, then went through all of his pockets, and repeated each of these actions a dozen times. The passengers all got next, and began to grin. "Get on to the hiker, countryman," said Patsy to Joe, and they both laughed. I told the Dutchman that the clock must have fallen down the leg of his underwear, whereupon the Reuben retired to investigate, searched himself thoroughly, and returned only to go through the same motions, and then retired to investigate once more. It was as good as a comedy. But it was well there were no country coppers on that train. They would not have cared a rap about the Dutchman's loss of his property, but we four probably should have been compelled to divide with them. Grafters are a superstitious lot. Before we reached Buffalo, a feeling came over me that I had better not work in that town. So Joe, Dan and an English grafter we had picked up named Scotty stopped at Buffalo, and Patsy and I went on. Sure enough, in a couple of days Joe wired me that Scotty had fallen for a breech kick and was held for trial. I wired to Mr. R., who got into communication with Mr. J., a Canadian Jew living in Buffalo, who set the wires going. The sucker proved a very hard man to square, but a politician who was a friend of Mr. J. showed him the errors of his way, and before very long Scotty returned to New York. An English mall buzzer, a girl, got hold of him and took him back to London. It was just as well, for it was time for our bunch to break up. We were getting too well known, and falls were coming too frequent. So we had a general split. Joe went to Washington, Patsy down east, Scotty to stir in London, and I stayed in Manhattan, where I shortly afterwards met Big Jack and other burglars and started in on that dangerous graft. But before I tell about my work in that line, I'll narrate the story of Mamie and Johnny, a famous cracksman, whom I met at this time. It's a true love story of the underworld. Johnny and Mamie, who, by the way, is not the same as blonde Mamie, are still living together in New York City after many trials and tribulations, one of the greatest of which was Mamie's enforced relation with a New York detective. But I won't anticipate on the story, which follows in the next chapter. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Autobiography of a Thief. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Autobiography of a Thief by Hutchins Hapgood. Chapter 5. Mamie and the Negotiable Bonds. Johnny met Mamie when he was 16. At that time he was looked up to in the neighborhood as one of the most promising of the younger thieves. He was an intelligent, enterprising boy, and had, moreover, received an excellent education in the school of crime. His parents had died before he was 12 years old, and after that the lad lived at the Newsboys' lodging house in Rivington Street, which at that time, and until it ceased to exist, was the home of boys, some of whom afterwards became the swellest of crooks, and some very reputable citizens and prominent politicians. A meal and a bed there cost 6 cents apiece, and even the youngest and stupidest waif could earn or steal enough for that. Johnny became an adept at hooking things from grocery stores and at tapping tills. When he was 13 years old he was arrested for petty theft, passed a night in the police station, and was sent to the Catholic Protectory, where he was the associate of boys much older and wiser in crime than he. At that place were all kinds of incurables, from those arrested for serious felonies to those who had merely committed the crime of being homeless. From them Johnny learned the ways of the underworld very rapidly. After a year of confinement he was clever enough to make a key and escape. He safely passed old Cop O'Hagan, whose duty it was to watch the Harlem Bridge, and returned to the familiar streets in lower New York, where the boys and rising pickpockets hid him from the police until they forgot about his escape. From that time Johnny's rise in the world of graft was rapid. He was so successful in stealing rope and copper from the dry docks that the older heads took him in hand, and used to put him through the fanlight windows of some store, where his haul was sometimes considerable. He began to grow rich, purchased some shoes and stockings, and assumed a tough appearance with great pride. He rose a step higher, boarded tugboats and ships anchored at the docks, and constantly increased his income. The boys looked upon him as a winner in his line of graft, and as he gave hodl (lodging house) money to those boys who had none, he was popular. So Johnny became chesty, began to spread himself, to play pool, to wear good linen collars, and to associate with the best young thieves in the ward. It was at this time that he met Mamie, who was a year or two younger than he. She was a small, dark, pale-faced little girl, and as neat and quick-witted as Johnny. She lived with her parents near the newsboys' lodging house, where Johnny still hung out. Mamie's father and mother were poor, respectable people, who were born and bred in the old 13th Ward, a section famous for the many shop girls who were fine spielers (dancers). Mamie's mother was one of the most skillful of these dancers, and therefore Mamie came by her passion for the waltz very naturally, and the light-footed little girl was an early favorite with the mixed crowd of dancers who used to gather at the old Concordia Assembly Rooms on the Bowery. It was a case of mutual admiration, and the boy and girl started in to keep company. Johnny became more ambitious in his line of graft. He had a girl. He needed money to buy her presents, to take her to balls, theaters and picnics, and he began to gun, which means to pick pockets, an occupation which he found far more lucrative than swagging copper from the docks or going through fanlight windows. He did not remain content, however, with dipping, and with several much older grafters he started in to do drag work. Drag work is a rather complicated kind of stealing, and success at it requires considerable skill. Usually a mob of 4 grafters work together. They get tipped off to some store where there is a line of valuable goods, perhaps a large silk or clothing house. One of the 4, called the watcher, times the last employee that leaves the place to be touched. The watcher is at his post again early in the morning to find out at what time the first employee arrives. He may even hire a furnished room opposite the store in order to secure himself against identification by some Central Office detective who might stroll by. When he has learned the hours of the employees he reports to his pals. At a late hour at night the 4 go to the store, put a spindle in the Yale lock and break it with a blow from a hammer. They go inside, take another Yale lock, which they have brought with them, lock themselves in, go upstairs, carry the most valuable goods downstairs and pile them near the door. Then they go away, and in the morning, before the employees are due, they drive up boldly to the store with a truck, representing a driver, 2 laborers and a shipping clerk. They load the wagon with the goods, lock the door, and drive away. They have been known to do this work in full view of the unsuspecting policeman on the beat. While Johnny had advanced to this distinguished work, Mamie, too, had become a bread earner, of a more modest and a more respectable kind. She went to work in a factory and made paper boxes for $2 1/2 a week. So the 2 dressed very well, and had plenty of spending money. Unless Johnny had some work to do, they always met in the evening, and soon were seriously in love with one another. Mamie knew what Johnny's line of business was, and admired his cleverness. The most progressive people in her set believed in getting on in any way, and how could Mamie be expected to form a social morality for herself? She thought Johnny was the nicest boy in the world, and Johnny returned her love to the full. So Johnny finally asked her if she would hitch up with him for life, and she gladly consented. They were married, and set up a nice home in Allen Street. It was before the time when Jews acquired an exclusive right to that part of the town, and in this neighborhood Mamie and Johnny had many friends who used to visit them in the evening. For the loving couple were exceedingly domestic, and when Johnny had no business on hand, seldom went out in the evening. Johnny was a model husband. He had no bad habits, never drank or gambled, spent as much time as he could with his wife, and made a great deal of money. Mamie gave up her work in the shop, and devoted all her attention to making Johnny happy and his home pleasant. For about 4 years Johnny and Mamie lived very happily together. Things came their way, and Johnny and his pals laid by a considerable amount of money against a rainy day. To be sure, they had their little troubles. Johnny fell, that is to say, was arrested, a score of times, but succeeded in getting off. It was partly due to good luck, and partly to the large amount of fall money he and his pals had gathered together. On one occasion it was only Mamie's cleverness and devotion that saved Johnny, for a time, from the penitentiary. One dark night Johnny and 3 pals, after a long conversation in the saloon of a ward politician, visited a large jewelry store on Fulton Street, Brooklyn, artistically opened the safe, and made away with $15,000. It was a bold and famous robbery, and the search for the thieves was long and earnest. Johnny and his friends were not suspected at first, but an old saying among thieves is, "Wherever there are 3 or 4, there is always a leak," a truth similar to that announced by Benjamin Franklin, "3 can keep a secret when 2 are dead." One of Johnny's pals, Patsy, told his girl in confidence how the daring touch was made. That was the first link in the long chain of gossip which finally reached the ears of the watching detectives, and the result was that Patsy and Johnny were arrested. It was impossible to settle this case, no matter how much fall money they had at their disposal, for the jeweler belonged to the Jewelers Protective Association, which will prosecute those who rob anyone belonging to their organization. As bribery was out of the question, Johnny and Patsy, who were what is called in the underworld "slick articles," put their heads together and worked out a scheme. The day of their trial in the Brooklyn court came around. They were waiting their turn in the prisoner's pen adjoining the court when Mamie came to see them. The meeting between her and Johnny was very affecting. After a few words Mamie noticed that her swell Johnny wore no necktie. Johnny, seemingly embarrassed, turned to her court policeman and asked him to lend him his tie for a short time. The policeman declined, but remarked that Mamie had a tie that would match Johnny's complexion very well. Mamie impulsively took off her tie, put it on Johnny, kissed him, and left the courthouse. Johnny was to be tried in 10 minutes, but he induced his lawyer to have the trial put off for half an hour, and another case was tried instead. Then he took off Mamie's necktie, tore the back out of it, and removed 2 fine steel saws. He gave one to Patsy, and in a few minutes they had penetrated a small iron bar which closed a little window leading to an alley. Patsy was too large to squeeze himself through the opening, but stalled for Johnny while the latter made his gets. When they came to put these 2 on trial, there was a sensation in the court. No Johnny! Patsy knew nothing about it, he said, and he received 6 years for his crime. But Johnny's day for a time in the stir soon came around. He made a good touch and got away with the goods, but was betrayed by a pal, a professional thief who was in the pay of the police, technically called a stool pigeon. Mamie visited Johnny in the Tombs, and when she found the case was hopeless, she wanted to go and steal something herself so that she might accompany her boy to prison. But when Johnny told her there were no women at Sing Sing, she gave up the idea. Johnny went to prison for 4 years, and Mamie went to a tattooer, and as proof of her devotion, had Johnny's name indelibly stamped upon her arm. Mamie, in consequence of her fidelity to Johnny, whom she regularly visited at Sing Sing, was a heroine and martyr in the eyes of the grafters of both sexes. The money she and Johnny had saved began to dwindle, and soon she was compelled to work again at box making. She remained faithful to Johnny, although many a good grafter tried to make up to the pretty girl. When Johnny was released from Sing Sing, Mamie was even happier than he. They had no money now, but some politicians and saloon keepers who knew that Johnny was a good money getter set them up in a little house, and they resumed their quiet domestic life together. The happiness did not last long, however. Johnny needed more money than ever now, and resumed his dangerous business. He got in with a quartet of the cleverest safe crackers in the country, and made a tour of the eastern cities. They made many important touches, but finally Johnny was again under suspicion for a daring robbery in Union Square, and was compelled to become a solitary fugitive. He sent word through an old-time burglar to Mamie, exhorted her to keep up the home, and promised to send money regularly. He was forced, however, to stay away from New York for several years, and did not dare to communicate with Mamie. At first, Mamie tried to resume her work at box making. But she had had so much leisure, and had lived so well, that she found the work irksome, and the pay inadequate. Mamie knew many women pickpockets and shoplifters, friends of her husband. When some of these adventurous girls saw that Mamie was discontented with her lot, they induced her to go out and work with them. So Mamie became a very clever shoplifter, and for a time made considerable money. Then many of the best guns in the city again tried to make up to Mamie and marry her. Johnny was not on the spot, and that, in the eyes of a thief, constitutes a divorce. But Mamie still loved her wayward boy and held the others back. In the meantime, Johnny had become a great traveler. He knew that the detectives were so hot on his track that he dared to stay nowhere very long, nor dared to trust anyone, so he worked alone. He made a number of daring robberies, all along the line from Montreal to Detroit, but they all paled in comparison with a touch he made at Philadelphia, a robbery which is famous in criminal annals. He had returned to Philadelphia, hoping to get a chance to send word to Mamie, whom he had not seen for years, and for whom he pined. While in the city of brotherly love, he was tipped off to a good thing. He boldly entered a large mercantile house, and in 13 minutes he opened a time-locked vault and abstracted $300,000 worth of negotiable bonds, and escaped. The bold deed made a sensation all over the country. The mercantile houses and the safe manufacturers were so hot for the thief that the detectives everywhere worked hard and on the level. Johnny was not suspected then, and never did time for this touch. For a while he hid in Philadelphia, boarded there with a poor, respectable family, representing himself as a laborer out of work. He spent the daytime in a little German beer saloon, playing pinochle with the proprietor, and was perfectly safe. But his longing for Mamie had grown so strong that he could not bear it. He knew that the detectives were still looking for him because of the old crime, and that they were hot to discover the thief of the negotiable bonds. He sent word to Mamie, nevertheless, through an old pal he found at Philadelphia, and arranged to see her at Mount Vernon, near New York. The two met in the side room of a little saloon near the railway station, and the greeting was affectionate in the extreme. They had not seen one another for years, and hardly a message had been exchanged. After a little, Johnny told Mamie proudly that it was he who had stolen the negotiable bonds. Now, he added, we are rich. After a little I can sell these bonds for 30 cents on the dollar, and then you and I will go away and give up this life. I'm getting older, and my nerve is not what it was once. We'll settle down quietly in London or some town where we are not known and be happy, won't we, dear? Mamie said yes, but she